Go. Uh, Today, we're going to start out with our keynote speakers. David Gates has graciously agreed to present all week for us. Many of you know David for his work across the Commonwealth for, can I say the last few years, David? Um,
A
and
year, a year
David,
or two.
just a year or two. Okay. Um, David has been helpful to so many families and individuals living with disabilities for, like I said, a few years. And David is here today to talk about housing options. And so I'm going to read his bio just for a second here. Since 2003, David has worked with numerous self-advocates and families to develop creative housing models, including home ownerships, microboards, and projects with housing developers. He's also done 17 trainings across the state since 2010 on housing options for people with disabilities, along with numerous other trainings on services. He has also participated in housing committees for the Department of Human Services and Department of Aging. For the past 5 years, he was a project lead for a housing project funded by the PA Developmental Disabilities Council. He currently consults for the PA Family Network and provides housing counseling under waivers for Terrapin House. He is joined today by Gabriel Smaglick. And Gabriel, I'm proud to say, is an advisor for the PA Family Network. And Gabriel has a significant other. He was joined in a commitment ceremony to his beautiful wife, Elizabeth. And they have a wonderful fur child, Max, who lives with them in their apartment, if you will, that is part of our household. And he lives in a big multi-generational family. He says we're like the Brady Bunch. There's a whole bunch of us. Yes, our last names are the same. Gabriel is related to me. He's very passionate about disability history and wants to change the perspective of people about disabilities and what disability means. He believes that darkness might follow him, but he has a light, and that light is always going to guide him. So he's here today to talk about his plans for independent living. So Gabriel and David, please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Diana. I would like to thank PA Family Network for hosting this series of summits this week and for inviting me to participate in that. And specifically, I'd like to thank Diana and Courtney for all their work in pulling this all together, because there's really a lot involved, and you will hear several speakers today. And every day they've had other speakers in the afternoon who have shared great information. So even if you're tired of looking at me or hearing me, I ask you to stay on, because you'll hear some very interesting folks in the afternoon. So I am today I have Gabriel with me, and so he will be talking about his vision, his plans, and we really look forward to hearing from him. But a few things first to start out. First of all, I do need to say that some of the portions of the materials that you will see today were previously developed by myself, Values into Action, Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation, Families Can, Carousel Connections and Regional Housing, Legal Services for the Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council. In addition, I will point out that experience so far the past 3 days has shown that we probably won't have time during this session for questions that I will answer live today, but I would ask that you put your questions in the chat, and Diana will forward those to me, and I will do my very best to try to answer all of those questions probably next week. In addition, you will be receiving the PowerPoint that you'll be seeing today later on. So you don't feel like you need to take copious notes of everything here. You will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint. Okay, now I need to share my screen. And that's it. All right, so here we are. Now, I do want to start by saying that there are 3 takeaways I hope you will glean from this presentation. One is that people with intellectual disabilities and autism can and do live in homes of their own. Number 2, thorough planning is essential to ensure successful transition from a family home or residential program to a home of one's own. And a big portion of these sessions today, throughout the day, will be focused on planning. And then third, there are resources available to assist with that planning. So I know that people may think, well, I don't even know where to start. So we will be providing you with a lot of information, links to a variety of resources, and you'll be hearing from a number of different speakers about resources that they can provide. Now, achieving your vision, which I call planning for a life outside your family's home. I've put a link here to a YouTube video, which is one that we did during our grant from the Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council, which highlights 3 self-advocates who are in fact living in their own home with some supports. And these are individuals that were supported by Families Can, Carousel Connections, and Values into Action. But what you will be hearing if you click on that, and I hope you will, it's a short video, is really their own words as to why living in their own home is important to them and what was necessary to accomplish that. So I think that hearing from self-advocates is frankly some of the best way to understand and appreciate that people with disabilities can live in their own home. So let's talk about vision. That's the first point here. How do you determine your vision? So we are recommending that you use a tool or set of tools called Charting the Life Course. Now, this is something that the PA Family Network have been providing information, courses, webinars on for some time, and they are really the experts in Pennsylvania on this curriculum, this body of tools that can help develop your vision and start in planning. So there's the links for the Charting the Life course. The first one is the Vision for Equality PA Family Network link. And then this is a national program. So I've also placed the link for the national program of Life course. And there is a lot of information, a lot of tools, a lot of documents there that I think are very useful in terms of starting this planning process with first the vision and then the ongoing planning. So there's when we talk about housing, I think it's important that we don't look at housing as something separate and apart from the rest of your life. So there's a number of life domains that Charting the Life course focuses on, and these are really quite important in terms of your housing plan as well as generally speaking. So we have to look at things as your daily life and employment. Community living, of course, that's the housing component. Safety and security, of course, comes up when you're thinking about moving out of a family home. Healthy living, social and spirituality, advocacy and engagement, integrated supports. These are all key areas that you need to consider when you are doing your housing planning. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Gabriel for him to talk about his vision and his plan. And there is his star, which is part of the Life course planning tools.
Hello, everyone. One thing about my personal strengths and assets, I'm good with public transportation. My significant other's a hard worker. We both love each other. We have a good relationship with our families, and Liz is a good driver. Future things that we need to develop is like develop skills on communication, learn about budget, money and budgets, learning to cook, caring for a home, keep keep good jobs, save money. Let's see, for relationships, mom and dad, extended family, church family, priest. We have to think about what we're gonna do if we go to eventually move out is what are we plans on for about a dog, talking to our landlord. So a couple of good friends. And we need to work on in the future is work on developing new and appropriate friendships. Technology, cell phones, laptops, telehealth, checking our work schedules, Alexa, alarms,
Every day at 5 a.m.
tell alerts from pharmacy and doctor care. Sorry about that. See what I mean? Online for future, online classes, recommunication, money classes, budget classes online, how-to videos on cleaning and maintenance. For now, community living, we know the bus system, we go to the gym, Planet Fitness. We have a library, we have Walmart, we have pharmacy, we have our doctors, we have our church, we have our astronomy club that we're part of. We're a hockey club season members. The future thing is how to respond to first responders. Insurance, landlords, how to communicate with landlords and deal with appropriate situations. Now we have, for eligibility specific, now we have Liz has a license. I have SSDI. I have a PA Able account. We have a Walmart discount card. We have for future a marriage license and waiver. These are all things that we have to eventually work on if we ever want to think about moving out of my parents' house. But right now we're living in the apartment that's in the basement. But it's almost like we're working on goals each and every day because they all work on to the bigger picture. And the one thing about it is it's not going to take easy. It's not going to be easy as one day you're going to accomplish all these things in one day. It's going to take maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe 6 months, maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years. But the only thing you got to do is put in effort and work on it. That'll be my dog.
Okay, Gabriel, thank you. I have to say that Gabriel has just summarized this entire presentation in like 5 minutes. So if you have something else to do, you can go do it because now you've heard the highlights of this whole thing. So thank you. That really makes the point about this planning. What you see here is the beginning of a really thorough plan of moving towards a home of their own, and but you see all the different elements that need to be considered. So I'm going to talk more about this in detail, but you've really got the highlights right now.
Well, actually, and I also use some of your resources to check it out for my own setting.
Right. So I think the one thing that I can add as we go along are the resources. So this presentation will have lots of links to many resources for you to check out to help in this planning process. So let me move on to, okay. So Gabe's talked about the different skills that he and his wife have, and looking at the skills that they need to develop or acquire. And then the other part of the planning is where you get help with those skills and resources. So in terms of housing counseling, one of the things we do is to do a resource inventory and to look at the individual's current skills, which Gabe's star shows that really is a resource inventory, and to look also at what's known as social capital. Now, in the next couple of sessions, there'll be a lot of talk about money, and certainly money is important, but social capital, non-financial resources are also important, can be equally important. And now we're talking about family, we're talking about friends, people who can assist in some fashion. They may be people who can help you find a house or apartment, people who can help you find a job. This is all part of your social capital, and so you should be thinking about your social capital in addition to looking at your financial resources.
Even finding a plumber.
Yeah, right. Do you know somebody who knows a guy? Yep, I've got a guy. That is an important part of social capital. Thank you, Gabriel. That was really very useful. Okay, you need to look at your existing support, both natural and paid, because you may need to change that. You may need to increase it if you're living outside of a family home or a licensed residential program. Now let's get into money a little bit. You need to review and establish credit. Now, credit is really important because if you're looking to move into an apartment, or certainly if you're looking to buy a house, and in fact, people with disabilities do buy houses in their own name, and we'll talk about that a little later, but credit is really essential. Good credit is essential. So you want to see if you have credit, and if so, what your credit score is. So you need to know that there are 3 what's called credit reporting agencies throughout the country. And these 3 agencies compile your credit history. Have you bought things on credit? If so, how much? And how have you been in terms of repaying? Have you paid back on time? And they then compile what's called a credit score, or what is also known as a FICO, F-I-C-O score. And that is something that most landlords and certainly all mortgage companies will look at to determine whether you are credit worthy for them to rent to you or to give you a mortgage. So I will say that if you have a credit score, a FICO score below 650, you definitely should be looking at ways to improve your credit. Now, there are folks with disabilities who may have no credit score, no credit at all, because they've never purchased anything on credit. It will be important to establish a credit history before you think about moving out. And one way to do that is to apply for a credit card and then buy something, hopefully a small item that you can afford, but make sure you pay it off on time. And if you're paying in installments, one way to do that, if you have a bank account, and we'll get to that in a minute, but assuming you have a bank account, link it to that credit card and set up what's called auto pay so that it will come out automatically. You don't have to remember to pay, and that way you can establish good credit. There is a good resource from Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation, PATF, on establishing credit, and the links are in the bottom of this slide, and again, you will receive these documents, this PowerPoint later on, so you don't have to write all this down. But they have a good guide that really goes through how you find out what your credit is and how you establish credit or improve credit if your credit is poor.
Like Netflix, for example, like you said that one time. You said about Netflix, about just use it and just connect your bank account, pay automatically the $10.
Exactly. That's exactly right, Gabe. Okay, so skills to consider. Now we've talked about the credit part. Now let's talk about some personal skills. And Gabe had already mentioned communication skills and interpersonal skills, being able to deal on a positive manner with landlords, with roommates if you're going to have any, and with neighbors. When you move out, you will have neighbors in all likelihood. So you want to be able to try to get along with everybody, because that can be a real challenge after you move in if you don't have good relationships with open communication. That is one way of ending up either being evicted or wanting to leave because of problems with either your landlord or your neighbors. Now, Gabe had mentioned banking. So banking is also important. When you move out, and we are assuming, frankly, for purposes of this presentation, that you are going to move into an apartment or house or condo in your own name. There may be other people's names on it. You may have a parent or other family member co-sign. That's fine, but that you will at least be one of the people on the lease or on the mortgage. So you need to pay your rent or your mortgage. And so how do you pay? Typically, you have a bank account, and you either pay by check or something called ACH, which is a direct payment out of your account. And so being sure that you have a bank account is very important. Another resource, again, from Pennsylvania Assistive Technology, explains about banking, how to get a bank account. There are some special provisions, banks in Pennsylvania that will open bank accounts for people who have very limited funds. Also, budgeting is another important part. So you have a bank account, you have bills, you need to understand what you can afford and how to pay that. And we had previous sessions about budgeting, and so you can see those later on, but this is an important tool and skill to learn. And again, the document, the guide from PATF goes through budgeting as well. Other skills that you need to acquire are meal planning, food shopping, and meal prep. So when you are living on your own, you will be responsible for the meal planning, food shopping, and meal prep. Now, you may very well have folks who can support you in doing that, but there's no one else that will have the legal responsibility to do all this. So developing these skills so that you can either do it yourself or at least participate with your supporters in doing these key tasks is very important. Personal hygiene, bathing and toileting, these are all key things. Since you're not likely to have someone who's actually going to be in the bathroom with you, cueing you in all parts of this when you move out, these are tasks that you should learn before you move out. Cleaning the house or apartment and removing trash. Again, this, if you move out, is your responsibility. So developing those skills, or at least developing a plan for supports so that this will be done. The last thing you want to do is get evicted even though you're paying your rent because of poor housekeeping, especially if we're talking about food scraps being left around, dirty dishes in the sink, and the next thing you know, bugs appear. And if those bugs make their way to a neighbor's apartment, you are facing eviction. ability to follow a plan in case of an emergency. Now, there are emergencies that will occur. Sooner or later, the electricity is going to go out, or a pipe may burst, or you have a leaky faucet, or the toilet is running. What do you do about that? So now we're not saying that you're not necessarily responsible for all those issues. If you have a landlord, the landlord is in most cases responsible, but you need to have a plan to address that. So if the lights go out, what do you do? And so you will be developing that plan before you move in, but the skill that you need to develop is having that plan in place. Can you follow the steps of that plan? So for example, one real life example of one of the self-advocates that we supported was his plan, if something went wrong, was to use his cell phone to call a family member. Okay, but the problem was he was not really comfortable using his cell phone. So in that case, you have a plan, but you have to develop the skill of being comfortable to use the cell phone when an emergency arises. Now, these kinds of skills should be addressed in your individual support plan. So everyone who is enrolled in the intellectual disability or autism programs through your county should have an ISP, regardless of whether you have a waiver or not. If you don't have a waiver, it's known as a planning ISP, but that's still something that you should have, that you work with your supports coordinator to develop. And so these skills should be part of your ISP. And the skills should be listed. And in addition, there should be identification of who is going to assist with you to develop those skills. Now, towards the end of the ISP, there's a section there that talks about outcomes. And here, when we're looking towards independent living and housing, you need to have what's called an outcome phrase in your ISP. And so the phrase that we typically recommend that supports coordinators put into the ISP for housing purposes is independent living. Now, it doesn't have to be this. However, we have found that so far the counties have accepted this as a viable outcome for people's ISPs that will give authorization for the additional services and supports a person may need to develop and implement their plan to move into a home of their own. Now, I will point out here, and this is something that Gabe already mentioned, so let me repeat his point, that individuals acquire these skills at their own pace. As he said, it may take a month, it may take a year. So you have to be patient, but you should track progress. Even small bits of progress should be tracked and should be celebrated.
Exactly, it should be celebrated.
And you also recognize that you may have periods of regression. And this happened to a lot of folks during the pandemic, but don't give up. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So keep at it. You may change your approach to a particular skill building or focus on a different skill when regression occurs and then come back to that other skill later on. Okay. Now, continuing with this ISP, there are particular sections in here where we really focus on these skills. And there is a section called Important to Individual under the Individual's Preferences section. So this really needs to be focused and what I usually see with an ISP is that there'll be some things about it's important for the individual to get out in the community, important to have friends and relationships and stuff like that. And that's all great. But when we're looking at housing, we need to think about other things that are important in the context of housing. So, for example, is it important to the individual that they share their apartment or house with another individual, that have a roommate? Is it important to them to live either in the city or in a rural area? Those are the kind of things that you need to think about that may not have been in your ISP previously, but should now go into the individual preferences section of the ISP. Also review the section called What Makes Sense. So, and this is looking at what kinds of supports, what kinds of locations might make sense for the individual and what does not make sense. There's another section called Health and Safety. This is also important and focusing now on the safety aspects. If you have an individual who elopes, for example, that's definitely a consideration, and you want to figure out whether independent living is practical, and if so, what kinds of approaches are needed, maybe some assistive technology, remote monitoring in that situation. You also want to identify personal safety concerns regarding fire safety. You also want to develop an emergency backup plan and a crisis plan. So the backup plan is when paid support or natural supports call off, they don't show up. Who's going to help out in that situation? And then the crisis plan, as Diana mentioned, is something that's going to be talked about to some degree in the next summits, particularly in the context of hospitalizations. But there are other crises that can occur, natural disasters, loss of power. You should have plans for those as well.
And fire.
And, oh, thank you. And fire, yes. What happens if there's a fire either in your apartment or in the apartment building, and the next thing you know, the fire department comes and everybody's told to get out of the building? What do you do then? Yes, thank you, Gabe. That's very important. Okay, now we're going to talk about planning in terms of location. Where are you looking for a house or apartment? And these are considerations in terms of determining where you want to look. One thing is, where are your support workers most likely to be living? Where are they coming from? Another part is public transportation. So in the North Central, that may not be a big, you may not have a lot of public transportation. That is certainly more important in the Southeast and the Southwest. Where are your family and other natural supports? So you may not want to move too far away if you are reliant on family members for natural supports to supplement your paid staff. Employment and volunteer opportunities. So we certainly want to encourage people with disabilities to be employed. So you want to look at, if you have a job, you don't necessarily want to move too far away from where your job is. And if employment is a goal, then you want to consider, where are the jobs, and consider whether you want to live in a place where there are jobs available that aren't too far away. Even if you have transportation, I know in the North Central, you can get some pretty bad weather in the winter. And so you may not want to drive 100 miles in a snowstorm to go to a job. So that is another consideration in terms of location. Also, medical professionals. So if you have specific doctors, hospital clinics, therapists that you go to on a regular basis, again, you may want to consider living in an area that is close enough to those medical professionals so that you can get there. Next is food markets and other retail stores. So food shopping, as I said before, is ultimately the self-advocate's responsibility. And so living in an area where there is a supermarket close enough that you can get to practically is another consideration. Houses of worship. If you have connections to a church, a mosque, a synagogue, a temple, you will want to consider living in an area where you can get there for services and for other activities. And then community activities of interest to the participant. So if there's certain things that you enjoy, you may want to move to a location where these activities are accessible. Other considerations. So do you prefer urban, suburban, or rural? If you have physical disabilities or sensory disabilities, you want to consider making sure that the house or apartment is accessible to you. So for example, if you're in a wheelchair, you don't want to be looking at a third floor apartment where there's no elevator. You want to consider assistive technology and other remote support needs. We'll talk about that a little later. What kind of medical supports you need, behavioral supports. Is there a provider if you move out? If you receive in-home behavioral supports, a behavior specialist, for example, will you be able to keep that provider? And then pets, which Gabe had mentioned previously. You want to talk any more about that, Gabe?
Well, pets, also consider, well, besides, what's it called,
Service animals?
service animals, how they have rights to be in the person's home because they're either the service animal for that person. But what about if you have a traditional like me, like a dog? Would it cost extra money to make a deposit, a security deposit, to keep my dog?
Exactly. Now, at towards the end of this presentation, I will have some links in there to a great resource that can provide information about the laws regarding reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities and the rights to have service animals in an apartment. So you'll have that later on. Other factors to consider, past rental history. If you have rented before, if your name has been on a lease, then you need to consider, were you late in any rent payments? Did you face eviction? Because that will make it much more difficult to get another place. And here it may be a situation where your name was on a lease with some other people and maybe they didn't pay the rent. But if your name was on a lease, you're still going to be stuck with that poor rental history. So you need to really look at that, and there are some things you can do about that. Also in criminal history, that can also adversely affect your ability to get an apartment. There is a resource, Self-Determination Housing of Pennsylvania has a training program called the PREP program. That's here and there. And you can't get the booklet online, but you can sign up for the training and you get the booklet, and they have a lot of information about how to address past rental problems and how to address criminal history.
And also the other factor you need to consider is credit history.
Yes, absolutely. And we had those other slides previously to talk about credit history. So you got to first find out what your credit is And the Pennsylvania Assistive Technology links that I placed in the previous slide tell you exactly how you can get your full credit report. You are entitled to get, I think, at least one free credit report a year, and you can look through from each of the 3 credit reporting agencies. You can look through and see what your credit score is, where they may have some issues showing up in your credit report. And sometimes the credit reports are wrong. They may show certain bills that you have disputed or have paid off. And so there is also a process to try and correct your credit report. If it shows bad credit, there is a way to try to address incorrect information in your credit report. Okay, some general planning resource material here. Again, Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation. There's a link there. They have a section in their study money guide called A Home of My Own, Preparing for Independence. And also there is a joint publication, or actually website, from the Housing and Services Resource Center of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and Housing and Urban Development, and there's a link to that resource as well. So another resource in terms of planning is a waiver services. Now this is available to individuals who are on the waiver. You'd have to be on the waiver to get this service unless you're going to pay for it privately. And this service is available for free for individuals who are on the Person Family Directed Supports waiver, commonly known as the PFDS waiver, the Community Living waiver, and the Consolidated waiver. It is not available to people on the Adult Autism waiver, unfortunately. It is also not available to individuals on the waiver who have been authorized for a group home, known as residential habilitation, or for life sharing or supported living, with the exception that someone who is in a group home and wants to move out into their own home can receive Housing Transition Tenancy Sustaining Services, or HTTS, to assist them in planning the move from the group home to their own home. Now, this service works by doing a housing assessment, and you would have a housing counselor, and this is something that I do, identifies the preferences and barriers to a successful tenancy. We would develop an individualized housing support plan, and then identify resources needed to implement this housing support plan. And then once the individual moves in, we can assist individuals in maintaining housing. So these are the 4 core activities that are done by a housing counselor under this Housing Transition and Tenancy Sustaining Service. Now, I will say that the service is free to those individuals on the PFDS, Community Living, and Consolidated waiver. However, the cost of those services, although not paid by the individual, the amount that would be billed to the state, to the waiver, is part of your budget, your service budget. Now, for Consolidated waiver, this really doesn't matter because there's no cap on your budget. However, if you are in PFDS or Community Living, there is a cap. So PFDS, it's $41,000 a year, and Community Living is $85,000 a year. So if the cost of your other services are close to that cap, you may not have enough money in your budget to afford the Housing Transition and Tenancy Sustaining Service. So you need to talk to your supports coordinator to check out, if you're on those other two waivers, whether there's enough money in your budget to have this service. Now, we have learned that many families and some self-advocates have fears and concerns about moving out of the family home or moving out of a licensed residential program. And so it's important that we address those fears. And to do that, what we have done in the past is connect with other self-advocates or families of self-advocates who have in fact moved out into their own home, and we call them peer mentors. And they have been very useful in allaying some of the fears that families and self-advocates have about moving out into their own home. Assistive technology and remote supports are also resources that should be considered to allay some of those fears. So identifying resources, let's talk about that. Determine the future needs. Okay, future supports. So you want to engage in others to provide some natural supports and also to identify ways of increasing the supports you have. So the PA Family Network has a number of programs about natural supports, circles of support and the like. There's some other resources I've listed here. Also mentioned here, supports brokers, and this can be a valuable resource. So one of the things you can do if you're in one of those three waivers, PFDS, community living, or consolidated, is you can hire your own direct support staff. And that may be helpful. Sometimes you may have a friend or neighbor or another family member who might be willing to provide some supports to you, but would need to get paid to do that. And you can do that by doing what's called participant directed services. And you can also have an individual or an agency that provides assistance with the hiring, the recruiting, hiring, scheduling, and other employer responsibilities if you want to self-direct your own services. And that service is called Support Broker Services. And you can find a lot of information about that through the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University. And there's the link for that. So identify what changes you may need to the waiver so that you will have sufficient supports in order to be successful in a home of your own. So I want to talk about those supports in the context of three types or categories of waiver services that can be very useful. So let me first talk about what we call discrete services, where you're using a service called in-home and community supports, another service called companion, and then a day program now called community participation supports, or CPS. So that one, what you need to realize in doing that, one is that you're going to have to coordinate other providers to put this together. It's kind of a jigsaw puzzle, and you have to piece that together with the assistance, of course, of your supports coordinator. And a housing counselor can assist to some degree in this as well. In addition to the coordination of what may be multiple providers for these services, if you need some supports overnight, you will likely need to have a special exception or approval from the State Office of Developmental Programs to get enough hours of support to have some overnight supports. There is a provision, let's get to that, in the waivers that limit you to 14 hours of paid supports combined of in-home and community supports, companion and community participation supports. So 14 hours is the general limit. If you need overnight supports and you already have day services, you're probably going to run over the 14-hour limit. So in order to use this model of piecing together what we call these discrete services, you will probably need an exception, what's called a variance, to get approval from the state to have that overnight support. And there is a form for this, and you would work with your supports coordinator. He or she would actually write out the form for the variance, and you must explain why you have medical or behavioral needs, particularly overnight, that would require more than 14 hours a day of paid supports. The next one is supported living service. Now I'm focusing now on those services paid for by the waiver that support people in their own home. There's a bunch of other services that I'm not going to talk about, like residential group home, because that's, I mean, really, that's not your own home. I'm talking about when I say your own home, a home that you're on the lease or on the mortgage, so that really is yours. Legally, you have a right to live in that particular setting.
Excuse me, David, you have 15 minutes.
All right. So supported living, this is an area where as a service, we work through a provider. They provide overnight on-call supports. It's not somebody in your apartment. So that is a possibility, but it's not one that's very useful for people who have high support needs, particularly overnight. Life sharing. I'm going to talk about a particular model which is useful in life sharing. Usually in life sharing, you're living in somebody else's home, but you can do life sharing in your own home. So in this model, if you can get the security deposit to move into an apartment of your own, and here you would need really a 2-bedroom apartment, you could bring in a friend, a relative, in an ideal case, it would be an adult sibling, have them move in, but the lease is in your name with permission to have another person there. You would use this life sharing model. The other person, the live-in, if you will, can get a stipend, a tax-free stipend through the waiver for being your supporter, typically during the overnight hours, but you can charge that live-in rent, which they could then pay from the stipend that they receive under the waiver. And then you take that rent that you're charging your live-in, could be a sibling, and you put that towards the money you get from Social Security and use that to pay your rent. So that is one way of getting an apartment of your own and obtaining the overnight supports, and you don't have to worry about that 14-hour limit either. So I'm going to then, let's see here. There's more resources here, but I'm going to move to the next presentation because we don't, the next portion here, because we don't have a lot of time. Let me get to that. Here it is. All right, so slideshow from beginning. So we're going to go through this pretty quickly. Developing the budget, I talked about that before. Here's some resources for the budget. Resources, I believe you will hear about ABLE accounts. You probably hear about special needs trusts. The kind of key takeaway is this is money you can set aside for various uses that will not affect your eligibility for waiver or other governmental programs. The big difference when we talk about housing is that an ABLE account, you can take money out and use it for your ongoing housing needs. That is kind of problematic for special needs trusts. So if you're looking to use something for housing, ABLE account is a very useful tool, but it is limited to how much you can put into that account, $17,000 a year starting next year. Employment is also very important. We encourage people to look for jobs, get jobs. Employment supports are available under the waiver. In addition, do not worry about losing your waiver or your other benefits by going to work. You do need to plan to make sure, because there are very good ways to avoid them affecting your benefits. We suggest you reach out to agencies that are called WIPAs, Work Incentive Planning and Assistance Programs. They're available for free in Pennsylvania. The toll-free number is on the line. If you're not eligible or can't get that service, benefits counselors are also available through the waivers. They're called CWIC, Certified Work Incentive Counselors. Let me talk about resources for different housing options. That's there. You will see it when you get the materials. You can look at that and determining the various housing options. For rental, you should know some people still think that if you're getting 30 hours or more a week of direct paid support, that you have to have your house or apartment licensed. That is not the case. That was changed several years ago. There's the actual bulletin if someone tells you you can't do this without being licensed. Shared housing is another model, and this one is where families get together and purchase a home, typically by forming a partnership, a legal partnership called a LLC, and then the adult children rent from this partnership. They would then get their own service provider. So it's not necessarily, this would not be a licensed kind of facility, is a shared housing model. And this has been used by this organization called A-Law, Autism Living and Working, quite successfully. Okay. But don't have more than 4 people in it. That causes real problems. Subsidized housing should be considered. I have a lot of resources further on in the materials that you will receive that goes through various forms of subsidized housing. We don't have the time today to go through that, but there's lots of materials on that. I do want to mention something that is particularly interesting and unique for people with disabilities. If you're able to get something called a Section 8 from your local housing authority, what you can do here is if the family can come up with a down payment on a house and get a mortgage and then buy a house, and the adult child has a Section 8 certificate, under federal law, you are allowed to rent, the family can rent to their adult child using the Section 8 certificate if that adult child has a disability. That would make that home affordable to the adult child because they would not have to pay more than a third of their income towards the rent. The housing authority would then pay the family, who are the homeowners, the rest of the rent up to an amount set by the federal government, by HUD. But then the family then would use that housing subsidy that they're receiving from the housing authority under Section 8, along with the rent they're charging their adult child, towards paying the mortgage. Now, there's going to be a shortfall, so they have to figure out how to pay the rest of it. But it is a very interesting model to consider if your adult child is lucky enough to get a Section 8. Home ownership is something that should be considered. As I mentioned previously, I've worked with 3 adult individuals with disabilities who in fact own their own home. It's called HomeWorks. You can find them on the web. There's a lot involved in this, and I have a bunch of materials in the resource section at the end for you to look at in terms of home ownership and some resources in terms of mortgages, particularly through the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency. And I've got links in the resources about them so you can learn about funding opportunities, mortgage opportunities for individuals with disabilities. Joint ownership between housemates, that is the HomeWorks model that I mentioned before. There is a organization called Regional Housing Legal Services that you can talk to if you're looking at a joint ownership model. They may be able to assist you for free or perhaps with a low fee to draft documents to formalize the ownership arrangement. Parents can own property with their adult child. Sometimes parents may put it into their will. However, you may want to consider doing this as what's called a joint ownership with right of survivorship. And this was actually mentioned yesterday. This is a way of ensuring that the home will pass to the adult child without incurring inheritance taxes. So it's something to consider. Funding for home ownership, I mentioned this PHFA organization, very helpful in terms of home ownership. And now, in terms of, we have talked about this in the context of the individual with disabilities actually having their own name on the lease or on the mortgage. So what about the situation where there's a question whether the individual has the necessary capacity to sign the lease or mortgage? So the approach that has been the usual approach in the past is to create a guardianship. So the guardian signs. However, that's not necessarily the way that has to be done. So what we are really pushing right now is a model called supported decision making. While this is not explicitly acknowledged in Pennsylvania law, it is certainly possible under Pennsylvania law. And there is, I know in a previous session, someone asked, well, what exactly is this supported decision making? Well, you'll find the answer at this website, supporteddecisionmaking.org. They have lots of information and forms and templates about the supported decision making. This is really beyond the time we have today to go through it, but there are resources that you can check to get lots of information and try to accomplish this. I know this is something that I've worked on with actually one of the advisors from PA Family Network who has done this for his son. So it has been done, it can be done, and I would suggest you look at the materials and also speak to PA Family Network about their experience in doing this. So last thing we had mentioned, Gabriel had mentioned about pets and what are your rights there. This is the list of resources from an organization, a fair housing organization, or equal housing organization, actually is what it's called, PA Equal Housing Organization, that has all the rules and regulations and laws as to your rights for reasonable accommodations in housing, modifications to the property. What are your rights to have modifications if you have physical limitations, and also rules about assistance animals. So that's all here, and you can look that up. So let me finish with conclusions. Again, I started out with people with intellectual disabilities and autism can and do live in homes of their own. But thorough planning is essential to ensure a successful transition from a family home or residential to a home of your own. And lastly, resources are available. What I've tried to do in this presentation is to provide you with links to many of those resources for you to check out so that you understand this is not something you have to invent the wheel. It's not something you have to do alone. There are lots of resources, paid and unpaid, that can assist you. And in these other slides here that unfortunately I don't have time to go through, I've listed many of these resources so that you can go through those when you get the PowerPoints later on, so you can have a real library of resources to work from and access to assist with your planning.
Ah. 19 minutes for me.
So, David, you have 4 minutes.
Oh, I don't know what to do with myself. Are there
This
any
is
questions?
great.
Is there a question or two I could answer in 4 minutes, perhaps? Or are just people so overwhelmed they don't even know what to ask?
No,
Oh.
today we didn't have any questions in
Gabe,
the
I'm sure
chat.
Gabe has, I know Gabe has something to add. Gabe,
Well,
you've been very helpful today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Family members, also, there's one thing you should think about doing with your loved one is teach them how to do food stamps.
Mm.
Like, you know, the newspaper articles, they have those where you get $1 off on this certain kind of cereal.
You mean
Oh,
coupons?
Coupons.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, yes, and with my remaining minutes, coupons. Yes, thank you. I hadn't even thought about clipping coupons. That's really a good idea. Thank you. But you did mention food stamps, and that's another thing. Nowadays, it's called SNAPs, Special Nutritional whatever program, assistance program, and that's something that many people who will be living in their own home, who are on limited budget, SSI for sure, and many people with Social Security disability may be eligible when they move into their own home to obtain food stamps or SNAP. That is something you apply through your county assistance office, or you can do it online at compass.pa.us. And so that's something you should look into in addition to clipping coupons. But thank you, Gabriel, for making that point. Also, you may be eligible for something called LIHEAP, Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. So if you live in your own home, you will have utilities. You'll need to sign up for those utilities when you move in. So that's part of your plan. Identify all the utilities you need, internet provider, who's providing your electric or your oil if you heat by that. And then during the winter, you may well qualify for energy assistance, whether it's heating by electric or oil or natural gas, through this low-income home energy assistance program, LIHEAP, through the county assistance office. So between the food stamps and this LIHEAP program, those are two important financial resources that you would apply for through your county assistance office that can help defray some of the costs of the food and your heating.
And also you should check out what the people that are the utilities, how much they cost. Like, do you have to go with this certain utility?
Mm-hmm.
Like, narrow it down to who sells the reasonablest.
Thank you.
You're right, Gabe. That is something we do here at the house, right?
Yeah.
But there is one question, David, which I thought was very interesting. And that is, has there been any success with neurodiverse people living in tiny home communities?
Oh,
You know, that's kind of a new movement, the tiny home
right.
communities. Are you familiar with that?
I am not. Yes, I am familiar with tiny homes. My wife is hot on tiny homes, and I'm trying to think about where the heck are we going to put 5 rooms of stuff into a tiny home. But yes, and I will say I have not seen it for neurodiverse people. However, there is a model that the State Department of Aging is actually implementing now. It is a model, ECHO, and they have what they're doing there is they're using actually modular homes, not exactly necessarily the same as tiny homes, but they are small homes that they are putting on property owned by other people, which is an interesting model. So that, say, for example, a family had a house with a large amount of land, and they could put a tiny home or what's called manufactured housing, a trailer,
Right.
onto that property and have that set up. I will tell you that one of the first clients I had that we did something called a microboard was where the family owned it was basically a farmette in Crawford County, a very rural area. And they had an old house where their kids had grown up, and the one child had autism and was on the waiver. And so what the family did, these were 2 elderly parents in their 80s, they actually moved out of the family home so that their adult son could move in with 24/7 supports, and they put a trailer on their property because they had plenty of room to do that, and so the elderly parents moved out into the trailer and gave the house to their adult son. And actually, so that became his permanent home, and he owned, I think it was put into a trust. So that's another model. You could do it in reverse, where the family moves out into the tiny home, or you could set one up in your own home. But there is this program, Department of Aging, and if you give me that question, Diana, I can actually provide some information about that program. But right now, it's only operated by the State Department of Aging. So you have to be either 55 or 60 to participate in that. But it might be an interesting program to consider with some advocacy with the Office of Developmental Program to do that.
That's really great. Well, I want to give everybody a chance to take a couple-minute break. David and Gabriel, thank you very much. This was a very lively and interesting discussion, and I really appreciate the information. I hope everybody enjoyed it as well. And we will be back at 11 o'clock with our next presenter, Liz Yoder from Planning Across the Spectrum. And Liz today is going to talk about a little bit of an interesting topic, planning for when you're gone. And I think one of the things that's really that I'm really interested in hearing about is that she's going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into reviewing that disabled adult child benefit. I think that's something a lot of us miss. And I think that's going to be really something that we really need to pay some attention to. So if you want to come back at 11 and hear Liz, I think that'll be great. This gives us time to fill our coffee cups and be ready to go at 11 o'clock. So
I recommend she come back, because I've listened to Liz now 3 days in a row, and it's always been very informative. So
50% of the benefit from the individual. So if there are 2 children who are receiving 75%, they can receive the full benefit of their parents' work record. They're always going to look at what's the highest. And if there's some crazy calculations to make sure that people are whole. So if one child is on one parent's work record and one is on the other, or they get some from one parent and top off from another, they're going to make sure that they can kind of account for the benefit that is going to be the best for them. So the family maximum is complicated, more complicated than you probably ever wanted to know about. But it is certainly part of the conversation. Usually, as I said, it's not a concern when the family's gone, or when one partner passes, or when parent passes, then there might be an adjustment of what the actual maximum amount received is going to be, because it just changes the equation. Thanks for the question. It was a lot. I know it was Social Security does not make things easy, but they do want to make things right. So it's complicated, but you might get more than you think you will, because they're trying to take pieces from different people's history than just the individual. So it's another good reason to work when you have a disability, because you're earning your own Social Security benefit. So anytime you can increase your own Social Security benefit, you're reducing the reliance on your family's Social Security benefit as a disabled adult child. So as long as you are working and maintaining your under the substantial gainful activity, that applies to your part. That kind of gets applied first, is your benefit, and then your parents. So thank you for that question. It was a lot, and I wanted to focus on this a lot because it is important and one that isn't always talked about. I wanted to make sure that the remaining thought that I share with you, and this there are a couple, is that a parent does have to apply for Social Security in order for this benefit to be enacted or given. A parent does not have to be fully responsible for the adult child to make the child eligible for the benefit. The parent does not have to be living with or supporting financially the individual. So, in the case specifically of divorced spouses or somewhat estranged relationships, um, the parent who's estranged or distant does not have to be very engaged at all in the life as long as there was some demonstrated commitment at some prior years that this was their child and that they were committed to them. If the relationship is distant, you can still apply for the disabled adult child benefit on your own. So, and if even if you don't know when your parent filed, you just know at some point in time, someone's gonna have to have filed for Social Security, and then you reach out to Social Security and say, "I believe my father or mother or parent um, has a Social Security benefit that I'm eligible for as a disabled adult child benefit." You give the Social Security number, date of birth, and name of your parent, and then you can become eligible for the disabled adult child benefit on their work record. It's just one thing that not all divorced spouses know, that you can file for the benefit on the divorced spouse, and the child can as well. So, um, particularly in this community, we know that a lot of families are separated from parents. So we want to make sure that that's clear as well. You don't have to be living with or close to a parent to be eligible for the benefit on their work record. And for those of you who are looking at filing for retirement or disability benefits for yourself, um, this is really like a checkbox kind of thing. So they will ask, "Do you have a disabled adult child?" But and you just say yes, and then give the Social Security number. They'll follow up and make sure that the record is within Social Security Administration to know that the child is eligible for that benefit. And I'm going to move on because there's more slides to go through, and this is just one little one, but I do like to get deep into it to make sure folks are aware and they can take advantage of that benefit, because it is one of the higher pieces of income that someone can receive during their lifetime, and not everyone applies for it when they're eligible. I had a client who applied for the disabled adult child benefit once her mom had passed away, and she had been eligible since she was 18. She had a developmental disability and never applied for benefits because the family wanted her to be as independent as possible. But she would have been eligible, not at 18, but when the parents retired. So it was a cultural thing, but it was certainly she needed during her life as an independent woman. So we made sure that she was able to kind of start up her income. All right. So we spoke about this a little bit yesterday, and I'll touch on it today. Social Security, supplemental security income, and Medicaid are very closely tied when you're eligible for disability through SSI, are very much likely to be almost automatically eligible for disabled Medicaid. You want to make sure that you're on the right Medicaid program to receive as much as you can from the Social Security, from the partnership of Social Security and Medicaid. Both are asset and income limited. And I'm going to move on here. SSDI again and Medicare are linked. So when you are on SSDI or the disabled adult child benefit, Medicare will come in 2 years after you become eligible. And That's a benefit that will be with you forever, even if you go off any other disability benefits. Um, these are kind of the differences and the similarities between Medicare and Medicaid. Both are funded federally, but Medicaid is also funded by the state. Medicare is that nationwide coverage. Medicaid is going to vary from state to state. And I want to pause here and just say if a long-term plan involves when a parent passes, an individual moves to another family's home or around other family, you want to make sure that you review the Medicaid systems because they're going to be very different than the ones that you're used to. And so I want to make sure that's clear and highlighted, that you spend time getting to know what the resources, the waiting lists, the opportunities are in other states. Pennsylvania has a very strong support model for care for people who need care. That's one of the stronger states that we've seen, particularly long-term care support. And just live in support. There's many communities that people are able to choose from. Central and Eastern Pennsylvania, I've seen the most there, I believe. But it's just kind of be aware that if the long-term plan is to move from state to state where other family or resources or friendships are, you want to make sure that that care plan is put into place well before you make that move. And sometimes during your lifetime, you may want to consider moving prior, so that you're closer to that transition and able to manage some of it and support the people who are around you to do that. So I wanted to highlight that as well. So financially preparing for no longer being around, certainly funding an ABLE is going to help support the individual with being more financially independent. The ABLE gives people the authority to use their own money as opposed to asking a trustee for support. It also allows that money grows tax-free, and it encourages in Pennsylvania that for you as the contributor, you get a deduction on your state taxes, which is wonderful. It's a high one in Pennsylvania too. It's $15,000 if you contribute that much, can be removed from your income taxes from the state. And so that's much more impactful to the family when they're gifting than the individual themselves, who are going to be mostly low income individuals. So again, if you move from state to state, or if your child is no longer living in Pennsylvania, you want to review if the other states have an ABLE program that do better for them in the long term, and consider moving their ABLE close to when you think you're going to pass away. Because it is a big help for taxes for you. But the plan should be that if there's a better program for the individual, that the ABLE can transfer to another ABLE. The reasons for doing this are primarily the Medicaid payback provision. So if a state has a waiver of the Medicaid payback provision in their ABLE account program, you want to make sure that they are having an ABLE that they're within their state's ABLE program. That may be more complicated than I made it sound, than I think it is, but certainly when you're moving from state to state, there's just a lot of pieces that you want to review to make sure that you're getting everything that you need for your loved one, and making sure that it's not set it and forget it ever with our planning. It's make sure that the laws are kind of what you think they are, have it reviewed, make sure that if there is a move, that everything's reviewed at that time or just prior, to make sure you're getting what you need. The advantages of the ABLE are certainly protecting these assets from SSI, SNAP, Medicaid. If people aren't going to be on those programs, you can still have an ABLE if you have a disability. And the reason why we would say that is if you wanted to have that superpowered Roth account where the income is that comes out is tax free and it's deductible on the other side. It's more like a health savings account actually than a Roth where you get that deductibility at the front and it's free coming out. So I'll move on and let the ABLE folks talk more about ABLE. Okay, so this heading I couldn't quite figure out how to name. This isn't quite the thing we're addressing, but I have to figure it out. But I do really love this meme. My advice is to invest in tennis balls. They have a high rate of return. I'm sometimes a nerd. So when it comes to kind of investing and making sure that savings is appropriately put aside for your loved one who's very likely oftentimes going to live longer than you, you want to make it as easy as possible. You don't want to have complicated strategies that make sense to you but don't make sense to them. You don't want to do things that are going to be complicated in an estate plan. You want to try and, during your lifetime, simplify things, make it easy, but also make sure that you're aware that your timeline for needing your savings is yours. And then your desire to leave money to your family and specifically to your loved one with special needs is going to be a different timeline. So when you kind of hear about asset protection and kind of asset management from the standpoint of, okay, in retirement, you're going to pare back and make sure that you're protecting your assets. That makes sense for some people of a certain asset limit who are going to live a certain amount of time. When we're talking about your lifetime and your loved ones, we're talking about a much longer timeline. And we're talking about two different sets of needs because your needs are going to be funding your retirement and theirs is going to be funding their retirement, their lifetime. And so being aware that the timeline is different than your peers without care support needs. Your financial strategy may be different than what your other siblings are doing. And what you've heard your worked for your friends and family. So make sure that you are aware of that difference. It's a unique need of your families to make sure that things that last a different timeline than your peers. Also take into consideration how much money is going to be needed. As I said earlier with the DAC, you want to make sure that you understand, like, what is the life that you will need to be funded once you're gone. And so as planners, we look at, budgeting, we look at making sure that an income and expenses make sense for the assets that are there. But you want to look at that and from your loved one's angle as well. What is the lifestyle that you plan for them that is kind of their comfort zone and what they want out of their life? And what of that life is being covered by their Social Security, by their home support, and by other things that they have available to them, their income from their work? And what there is the remainder that you need to leave to them? We always want to make sure that the disabled adult child benefit is taken into account, that it's not, again, going to be that one income, but it's going to be this other income when you're gone, and that those things are taken into account as much as your income and expenses have an impact on your own retirement. And when it comes to kind of leaving someone, you don't want to leave them too much either, because it was meant to kind of support your loved one in the life again that they're living. many people who are in supported communities don't have a lot of needs to kind of travel the world as you plan to do or to do different things. Many people have very simple lifestyles and don't need a whole lot. And many don't have that impulse control that we worry about with some folks and just won't even ask for money. And so you want to make sure that in your planning you look at, okay, what are the goals? What do you want that life to look like? Make sure you're including your loved one in that process and saying, okay, well, we're going to spend this amount of money this year, no matter what. So make sure that's available to them, and make sure you understand kind of how that's projected out in what you're planning to leave to them. Um, that's really the work that we do, and so I could get into it for hours and hours. Taxes do matter. So when you're leaving assets to loved ones, it does matter who is inheriting. Now, when it comes to trusts and leaving money and homes and property to trusts, that's going to be a corporate tax rate, and it's going to be kind of challenging to inherit assets that have to be paying taxes on. So the trustee will be responsible for doing an annual tax return, if at all possible, especially when you have a loved one who is going to be a trustee. You can simplify the taxes by encouraging or trying to strategize with what assets are being left so that the taxes become a little simpler. Certainly, when you have we usually recommend that retirement accounts, if at all possible, are not left in a trust because of the complexity of needing to take required minimum distributions every year. And if that can be left to any other family member, we would say that. So oftentimes it's a matter of, again, simplifying things for the trust, for the trustee, for your beneficiary, so that their life can be more focused on kind of the support and the care that they need to kind of live their best life. So the assets that we prefer people to have in their trust are going to be anything that's inherited tax-free, and kind of the taxable accounts, but not the ones that require distributions every year. Life insurance is certainly a very powerful tool to be left to a trust as well. I'm going to move on here. Well, what if I don't have money? There are many people who are struggling with kind of, they have what they have and they need to use it for their own retirement. Certainly, you don't have to worry about the savings interest rate if you don't have any savings. This is another silly joke. So if you are concerned, you don't need to worry about kind of the taxation of things. If there's going to be a little amount of money left over, if there's not going to be very much of an inheritance for your loved one, and being aware that the government benefits do go a long way. So if you can't provide for your loved one, making sure that they at least have connected support within their social work team, that they have family or friends or connections within community that can step in and support them through life, and to make friendships and to have rich, meaningful connections. That's going to be more important than kind of leaving them $1 million in a trust. It's just not going to be the same. They don't need that. They need the other things. So making sure that you're aware that you don't have to leave so much to your loved ones if you need it yourself. You need to take care of yourself first. You are aware that when you have assets, they will be liquidated at your death. some of them. If they're not being left to other people, they will be sold. So there will be things that turn into cash for your loved one, whether it be a home, a car that they're not using, um, property, furniture, anything that kind of can turn into cash that can be left in the trust as well. Life insurance can be a tool, and is this very powerful one when used correctly. And you want to make sure there's kind of two ends of the coin here. When with younger people, we say get term life insurance. You don't need to worry too much about getting a long term permanent plan put in place when you're younger, when you're still kind of in early work, because it's going to be too much, too expensive for you to live your life and to get what you need. So focus on protecting your income. If you have something happen to you and during your work life, that the term policy will cover you. Um, Later in life, when you're more comfortable, when you have more savings, you can looking at a permanent policy. But we do want to make sure people are aware that not all insurance agents are equal, and some will just sell you what they want to sell you and not kind of be aware of what your actual needs are. So you need to kind of be very clear with what you want. And when it comes to an agent saying, "Oh yeah, you can pay for college, you can pay for your long-term care with this policy because there's cash value there." Think about what your actual goal is. Make sure that you're funding the actual goal. And cash value life insurance is usually not the right tool for people who have permanent needs, because using that cash value for those other things are going to diminish the death benefit that you're actually leaving to your loved one. So the permanent policies that aren't accumulating cash value are really where we focus. The variable universal life insurance, other universal life insurance that tend to be more cost effective because they're invested and have a guaranteed death benefit regardless of what the market does. Those are the ones that we want to make sure people are looking at for that permanent need of going to a special needs trust at the end of your life. Having a family with a member with a disability does not make somebody qualified to be your professional who's advising you on things. Everybody is different, and everybody has a different path of understanding what the needs are. So just because your attorney has a brother who has autism doesn't mean he understands estate planning. And I'll get into this a little bit further on down the road. But just because you have a friend who, again, has a similar lifestyle and someone who has a disability in their family does not mean that they know what your situation is, what your benefits are going to be, and what your needs are. Make sure that you talk to professionals who are aware of all the different varieties of disability, all the different varieties of what is available to you so that you can find the right options. Retirement money and IRAs, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. So like leaving an IRA to an individual with a disability, technically you can do it, but should you? Probably not. And it's always the trust is going to be the primary owner of any asset typically. But at the end of the day, the stretch rule, while it exists, it's not actually super helpful for the trust to be doing these kinds of distributions. You have to have 3 accounts, an IRA, an inherited IRA, and a trust taxable account that comes to it. And then you hold it there, you distribute it. And it's just, if you have other assets that can go to the trust, we would recommend that instead of having this stretch requirement for the remainder of your loved one's life. because there are more taxes, because they're requiring taxation on things that don't necessarily need that draw. So then it just makes the maintenance of the trust more complicated. I say always at the bottom here, for those of people who are closer to New York or near New York or have lived in New York, IRAs are not housing in this slide. We're talking about retirement plans. IRAs in New York are one way of saying a supported group living home. So just wanted to make that clear. Okay, so how can you be legally prepared? Certainly have a special needs trust. A special needs trust or supplemental needs trust is what's created to protect Medicaid. Again, Medicaid is going to be the most important thing that you're protecting when you have a supported adult loved one. It gives all that work and housing and every kind of medical support to them. And you really do want to make sure that that's protected. Make sure so the language, of course, is to supplement but not replace or supplant public benefits when available to an individual. And it's created through Medicaid law. Again, it's highly dependent on state implication. So you want to make sure that if you are living in Pennsylvania, that you get a Pennsylvania attorney to review the Medicaid law to make sure that your trust is accurate and doing what you needed to do. Again, if you plan on moving as a family, or if you have moved and you have a trust from another state, always make sure you have that reviewed by a local attorney to make sure that it's doing what you need it to do for your loved one. Now, the trust itself will operate in the state that it's created, but it is oftentimes beneficial to get it updated to where you are currently living or where you anticipate you will be living when you pass. Just have it always reviewed. Again, with the special needs trust, there are two main types: first party and third party. First party is someone's own money from a settlement or having to a large chunk of money that can't be put into an able to become eligible for benefits, or from inheriting improperly. And so the first party is more restrictive and has those payback provisions back to Medicaid. Third party trusts are much more flexible. There's usually less court oversight and there's no payback provision. It also gives the family the ability to control on who receives the money once the beneficiary has passed away. And so you always want to kind of focus on making sure those documents are in place during your lifetime. Otherwise, the third party is going to not be an option for the individual, and they're going to need to establish a first party trust. Common mistakes and tips, and I think I'll have a couple more on this slide that we haven't written down. Don't use the attorney that helped you buy your house to put together your special needs trust. We've seen this. Don't worry. We've seen people are like, oh no, I really trust this guy. He's my business attorney. He's gotten me this. He's gotten me that, and he has a brother with autism, so he knows what he's doing. He does not. He does not. So make sure you're using a qualified attorney to look at your estate documents, who knows Medicaid law and not just real estate, who knows kind of the professionals in your area. An attorney is a really good resource for finding a network of support. So use the attorneys who have that network, not the ones who don't. It's a waste of your time. They may do a good job, but they may waste your time because they don't have those other resources. You want to be accessing the networks that are appropriate to your family. Do go through the pile of documents your attorney gave you. I've looked at an attorney at a document recently where the attorney accidentally duplicated one of their children's names. So they actually are disinheriting one of their children. So it's just a technical glitch, but certainly make sure that that gets fixed. There are other things that are much more problematic and that are confusing to anyone who's reading the document, including other attorneys. So if you see things that contradict each other, make sure that's clarified to you. Make sure that your attorney's aware of it. Make sure that they correct it if it needs to be corrected. Don't leave documents of old accounts around. And this other, do consolidate accounts. These are kind of the biggest love letters to your family. When you pass away, regardless of whether you're well or ill and you have time to prepare or not, your family's going to be hunting through your home for all the things that you left behind. As little notes of saying, what did mom do with this? What did mom have where? And if there's old account files laying around, they're going to be trying to find them, even if they don't exist. Make sure those things are shredded, get rid of them. They don't belong in your life. They don't belong as a wild goose chase in your loved ones' lives. Consolidate accounts. If you have multiple accounts in the same title, make sure they're combined so that it makes your life easier and the person who's going to be helping with your estate easier as well. Again, that person is very often the people you love the most. So don't put as much, give them a little bit of a break if you can, to kind of simplify your life while you're living. I do want to, I had another one, but I unfortunately can't remember at the time. If we get to it, we'll come back. Certainly get these documents in place. Wills, powers of attorney, advance directives, letter of intent is certainly another love letter to those people who are going to be left behind. The letter of intent is that document that you put into place that it's kind of like a living instruction guide to make sure that people know all the important things in your loved one's life that they can't communicate for themselves or they want support with. So make sure that that's in place so that people who will have to step into the care role can move forward with what life looks like for the supported individual. And living wills, again, another love letter. And that's the one that says, if I become incapacitated medically, these are the things that I want my family to know I thought about. And the decisions that I plan to make, if I can make them, so that it gives people permission to say goodbye. It gives people permission to do expensive treatments if you've thought about doing them yourself. So just make sure that those are in place. Always, you want to make sure that you review them together. And this is what I wanted to make sure. The beneficiaries on accounts do not look at your will and do not look at your trust. If you've not named your will or trust as a beneficiary of your accounts, it'll go as needed to kind of what the estate law is in your state. So make sure that if you have old beneficiaries listed or if you have someone listed directly, that'll go that way. And not listen to what you've written in your trust. Make sure they're always coordinated, that you always look at your beneficiaries when you update your estate plan. Building the right support network. Hopefully I could get through some of these things. Certainly, okay, so caregivers, always make sure that you're taking care of yourself. This poor cat, I feel so bad for her. But take care of yourself first. If you are not able to manage your own health and well-being, that will impact your loved one's health and well-being and safety as well. Share care. And this is what I was sharing earlier. If you can share care with others and see that other people have a different way, but a good way of being with your loved one, that will allow you and enable you to step back when you have to for your own medical needs or for your own retirement freedom, if that's something that you value. Always make sure that you give yourself that time and space to process that change for yourself, because other people can and will love your loved one. They will love and care for them in a different way than you do. And you just want to see those relationships during your lifetime instead of being afraid of them. That's really my biggest advice. Who will be there? So think about when you're listing your kind of trustees and other people. How much time do you spend supporting your loved one? And is the person who is next in line as available as you? Um, are you naming brothers or sisters, siblings as the next person who's going to be trustee or guardian? Do they have time in their life? Do they have other family, other in-laws who they're managing care for? Make sure that you think about that. And as much as possible, look at other professionals to help delegate those roles too, so that that role, when a new person becomes caregiver, can take care of themselves and your loved one as much as possible in the roles that they're given. Um, Plan now and don't plan later. Again, don't just listen to recommendations for friends, even if they have a child with a disability, because your life is very much different than theirs, even if they look very similar. There's very different resources available to each family. Um, um, Definitely kind of delegate as much as possible to the professionals. And one last thing, we just don't have enough time, but housing is very complicated. When you're looking at leaving housing to a loved one, it may be oftentimes the most easy solution, but consider who's going to manage the home when you're gone. Is that something that they'll be able to maintain their physical space? Are they going to have to hire professionals to come in to maintain the home? Are they going to have to hire professionals to come in and make sure that they're eating well? I had a client who was like, "Oh yeah, they have to. We cook everything because she has hand neuropathy. We need somebody to come in and do that." Oh yeah, yes, that's true. But just remember, like, it's not just housing. It's a living, breathing entity that needs to be cared for also. And so you want to make sure that within your plan, you're reviewing all of those needs of the home as well as your loved one. And of course, we have some crude jokes. I apologize, but too late for estate planning. So always try and get things done during your lifetime. There's so many things that you want for your loved one. And there's a lot of fear wrapped up into kind of leaving them behind, and you just want to. It's so much more. Can add so much peace to your life if you look at what the actual realities are in your life, and I highly recommend going through the process if you can. I'm going to stop sharing and see. I know we're kind of late, but I want to see if there are other questions that we can go through.
I think if you don't mind, Liz, because we are kind of late, I think we'll save most of the questions for tomorrow's Q&A,
Yeah.
and we'll also send the answers to those questions out to folks when we're finished with the summits, so that they'll have a chance to see those answers if they can attend tomorrow.
Yeah, wonderful.
Okay.
Sorry,
So-
again, I just packed everything in. So I
That's
hope
all right.
that this is helpful and meaningful and took a couple things away.
It is. And I think one of my advisors is going to give us some direction for our next steps? Noelle?
Thank you so much, Liz. My name is
Welcome.
Noel and I'm an advisor with the Pennsylvania Family Network. I want to let everyone know we will be taking a break from 12 to 1 for lunch. Please join us again at 1 o'clock for an amazing panel of presenters on future planning. You can stay logged in. Just turn off your mic and video. Have a great lunch.
Thanks, Noelle. Thank you, Liz. This was great. And I love the memes. Sarah, are you there?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
All right, just a couple minutes. We're going to welcome everybody back. People are coming in. You ready?
Oh, yes.
All right.
Diana, Sarah is not doing the introduction. She's just doing the welcome, correct?
Right.
Okay. Okay.
Right.
Just wanted to
Thank you.
Yeah.
We gave people till 1 o'clock to enjoy their lunch. So that means everybody ran and checked all their emails and
Yeah. I'm sorry. Against the screen there. I never have gotten really too used to these Zoom calls, to be honest. I'm always like fidgeting, and I'm not like that in person, but I just kind of, I'm sitting in a huge empty conference room. So I kind of feel like I'm alone, even though I've got 10 people looking at me, and probably more in a few minutes. I have to remind myself not to fidget and not to get real close to the screen and all the rest of it.
takes a bit of getting used to.
It does. It does. Yeah.
Well, it's nice to know that when we talk to our attorney and when we're talking about intimate topics like special needs, that they're human too. So
Sometimes, right?
people are still coming in. So we're going to give it it's only 12:59, but we're going to give it a minute or two because people are still really coming in. So if you don't mind waiting a minute, John and Sarah.
No, of course not. And I know they're going to have, a Q&A at the end. Will they all be muted? Because I don't mind if somebody interrupts and has a question immediately.
If
on
there's
the floor.
something that's integral to what you're saying, I will ask it, but we try to save the majority of the questions to the end because it may be that the other participants on the panel would
Yes.
have something to say as well. So
I'm sure they will, because I'm going to touch briefly just on how you fund a special needs trust. And one of the things I'm going to say is, financial planners are a real big part of that.
mhm.
Q,
And-
our financial planner on the panel. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. And she's very well spoken. So just give it, we still have people coming in. So I'm going to give it another minute or two. We have time. So thank you everyone for your patience. We'll get started in just a moment. We still have people coming in from lunch. Great, Courtney. I'm going to give it one more minute. And I think we're good. All right, Sarah.